Every artist has their own creative process, which is usually developed depending on what medium they're using the most. Some artists use a lot of paint, like oil paints, and so their creative process usually begins with blobs in different shapes and colors to block out their concept. While other artists, such as myself, are more used to starting with sketches and line work. But getting a look at different artists' creative process and seeing the steps they take can be an incredible insight into how an artist thinks, which can ultimately help a lot of beginners improve their work. So that's why I thought I'd give you guys a look into my process. While I've posted a few speed paints already, I figured providing some commentary to the steps I take would be a lot more helpful in understanding my thoughts while making the illustration and why I do what I do. I'll be using this illustration I made of Good Omens as an example. The speed paint for this illustration is available on my channel too, so if you're more interested in just seeing the drawing come to life without my endless yapping, please click the card in the top right corner of this video or go to the link in the description. Small disclaimer before we begin, while I have years of drawing experience, my art is still developing as we speak. There isn't just one way of drawing, so you don't need to follow my advice if it's the only way to do it. This is more meant as an inspiration for those who want to learn more from other artists, and it may be helpful to those who are just starting out. Now, every illustration starts with the most important thing, an idea. You need to figure out the concept for the drawing in your mind before you start drawing it. For this illustration, I simply wanted to draw the main characters from Good Omens, as I had just started getting obsessed with this show. I knew I wanted to draw them with their wings out, and I had a general concept in my head for how I wanted the image to look, so I went straight to the first sketching phase. I usually do 2 different sketches for every illustration. One sketch of basic shapes, to get the composition and the basic proportions of the characters down, and one sketch that has all the necessary details. The second sketch is usually clean enough for me to draw the line art over, but sometimes if I'm still figuring things out, I might do another cleaner sketch over top if it's necessary. Once the final sketch is finished and I'm satisfied with how the concept looks, I start working on the line art. One tip I have if you're making illustrations digitally is to use a background that isn't fully white. I sometimes forget to do this until I've already finished the sketches, but it's actually way better for your eyes to work on a background that isn't white. It doesn't have to be much darker, just anything that isn't pure white usually strains your eyes a lot less. For my line art, I just use the basic pen from Clip Studio Paint as my brush. It has the perfect texture for clean and crisp line art, but you can use any brush that suits you. To make my line art look more interesting, I often go back into my existing lines to thicken some parts. I also shade under the chin with pure black. There's no particular reason why I do this, I just like how it looks. Once I'm satisfied with my line art, I move on to basic colors. Now some artists love using the bucket tool to fill in their line work. For me, this only works sometimes. I must be too lazy with my line art to actually make the bucket tool useful, but it often bleeds through in other parts of my drawings, so I use the bucket tool only when I'm confident that it works. And even then I usually go over the edges by hand to avoid any small corners from not being colored in. For this particular piece, the bucket tool was definitely not going to work, so I used a base color to color all of the 2 characters in, to make sure I knew what needed to be colored and what didn't. After doing so, I opened a new layer and clipped it to the base color layer, and I added all of the colors in separate clipped layers until everything was properly colored in. I then fused all of these clipped layers to make one base color layer, as I will clip new layers on this base color for the shading, lighting, and other necessary details within the characters. For detailing, I usually do 1 or 2 layers of shading, depending on how much contrast I want in my illustration. My shading layers are just some slightly darker colors set to multiply, and changes in opacity depending on how harsh I want the shadows to be. In this case, I wanted there to be more shading to everything that was facing away from the light source, so Aziraphale would be backlit and Crowley would mostly just have his face in the light, while everything else would be taken by the darkness from below. One shading layer will cover all the harshest shading, so I do these shadows with a hard round paintbrush. I then use another shading layer to airbrush some other shadows in on a slightly lower opacity. Sometimes I do more layers of shading when I'm too indecisive to choose the opacity and harshness of my shadows. I'll recommend just playing around with this until you feel satisfied with how it looks. After finishing the shadows, I work on the lighting. These layers are usually set to soft light, but sometimes I use hard light as a layer mode when the lighting needs to be more dramatic. Once I have basic lighting down, I go back and forth between shading and lighting to add where necessary. Or to get rid of some. I overdo these things sometimes. I also often use an overlay layer, usually set to no more than 50% opacity, to have a bit of a color pop in the illustration. My go-to colors for this type of layer are yellows or oranges, and blues or purples. This is totally unnecessary, I just like how it makes my shading and lighting pop more. On a layer above my line work, I add a layer where I add highlights, for which I use a color that is almost white. I rarely ever use pure white, only when it's used somewhere else in my drawing, like a white background, for example. I usually start staring at my drawing more and more once we get closer to the end, trying to figure out if I'm happy with the result or if something is still missing. And when the final details are added and I'm satisfied, I write my name somewhere in the corner, and then we're done. For a quick overview, here's the sketch, the line art, the flat colors, and the final piece. So this is my entire process for most of my illustrations. Again, it's not the only way of making digital art, but this is the way I'm currently doing it. If I update my process in the future, I might make a new video for you guys. If you watched this all the way until the end, thank you so much. I really enjoy making these videos, and I hope to make more for you all soon. Until then, thanks for watching and see you next time.